Miles Davis said it in print, not once, several times, across several years, in the kind of language that leaves no ambiguity about what was meant. He called Louis Armstrong's performance style demeaning. He said it made him uncomfortable to watch. He used the phrase that carried the sharpest edge possible in those years from one black artist directed at another. Louis Armstrong heard about the comments. He always heard about them. People made sure of that, the way people always make sure a famous person knows they've been publicly diminished. He said very little in response. Not because he had nothing to say, because what he had to say was too large for the conversation being offered. To understand what happened between Louis Armstrong and Miles Davis, and what eventually shifted, you have to understand what each man was, what each man thought he was doing, and the specific historical moment that put them in conflict with each other. Louis Armstrong was born in 1901. He grew up under Jim Crow in New Orleans. He learned early and thoroughly the particular kind of intelligence required to survive as a black man in early 20th century America. The ability to be exactly what a white audience needed you to be, to read a room, to find the frequency at which communication happened without friction, and to use that frequency to get the music played. The smile was real. The warmth was real. But they were also tools, sharpened by decades of navigating spaces where the wrong response could end a performance, a career, or something worse. Armstrong understood this with such completeness that by the time he was famous, the performance and the person had become almost inseparable. He was not pretending to be joyful, but he was also not pretending that the joy existed in a vacuum, without context, without the accumulated strategy of a man who had learned to give audiences exactly what they needed in order to receive what he needed to give them. Miles Davis was born in 1926 in Alton, Illinois, into a middle-class family. His father was a dentist. He grew up with a different set of assumptions about what was available to him and what he owed to the comfort of white audiences. When he began his career in the mid-1940s, the bebop revolution was rewriting the rules of what jazz was supposed to do. Bebop did not entertain. Bebop demanded. You came to a bebop performance and you brought your full attention, or you were in the wrong room. For young musicians of Davis's generation, the contrast with Armstrong felt like a moral question. How could a man of Armstrong's genius submit to what they saw as the requirements of a white gaze? How could he smile and wave and play for audiences who were, in some cases, the same audiences that enforced or tolerated or ignored the conditions that had defined his entire life? It was a real question. But it was asked from a position that did not fully account for what Armstrong had navigated to get to the stage in the first place, or for what the alternative to that navigation had cost the people who chose it. Armstrong was aware of the criticism. He had heard versions of it since the 1940 seconds, when bebop first emerged and the new generation began drawing distinctions between their approach and his. He had even responded to some of it, quietly, in terms that those who heard him said were measured but not toothless. He said once that he had been playing jazz before the people criticizing him were born, and that he would still be playing it when they were done criticizing. But the specific force of Miles Davis's public statements was different from the general generational criticism. Davis was the most prominent figure of his era, the most respected voice in the post-bebop world, and when he said what he said, it reached everywhere. It appeared in major publications. Other musicians responded to it, agreed with it, built on it. It shaped how a generation of listeners and musicians understood Louis Armstrong's legacy. Armstrong did not issue a formal response. He continued performing. He recorded "What a Wonderful World" in 1967, which Davis publicly mocked as the most sentimental piece of commercial nonsense he could imagine a serious musician releasing. Armstrong heard that, too. What Armstrong said privately was different from his public silence. People who were close to him during those years said that the Davis criticism landed in a particular place, not because it questioned his artistry. Armstrong's confidence in his own artistry was total and not available for revision. Because it questioned his choices, his decisions about what to give and what to hold back. And those decisions had been made with full knowledge of costs that Miles Davis, from his specific position and generation, did not have to pay. There is a story, told by people who were present, about an evening in the late 1960s when Armstrong and Davis were at the same event, a music industry gathering in New York. They were in the same room for the first time in years. The tension between them, given the public record, was the kind of thing everyone in the room was aware of, and nobody was addressing directly. Someone in the room, accounts differ on who, managed to get a recording of Armstrong's West End Blues playing on a system in the corner. The 1928 recording. The one that had made jazz historians reach for their superlatives for 4 decades. Miles Davis stopped his conversation. He stood still. He listened to the whole performance without moving, without speaking, while the room did what rooms do when no one is sure what is about to happen. When it ended, Davis said something. The accounts of what exactly he said vary slightly in the telling, but what every account agrees on is the essential content. He said that no one who had ever lived played the trumpet like that. He said he had played for 25 years, and he still didn't understand how it was possible. He said Louis Armstrong had done something that year that nobody has explained since. He didn't say it loudly. He said it the way you say something you've known for a while, but have been refusing to say out loud. The accounts don't mention whether Armstrong was in earshot. In later years, in interviews given after Armstrong's death, Davis spoke about him differently than he had spoken in the 1950 seconds and 1960 seconds. The specific criticisms softened, not retracted. Davis was not a man who formally retracted much, but reframed. He said that Armstrong existed in a context that he, Davis, had not fully accounted for when he was young. He said that the choices Armstrong made were more complicated than he had understood them to be. He said that Armstrong had carried things that he, Davis, had not been asked to carry. He said, "Louis always knew something the rest of us were still trying to figure out." There is no clean resolution to this story. The tension between what Armstrong represented and what Davis's generation was reaching for was real and not manufactured. Both men were right about certain things. The damage that the public criticism did to how Armstrong was understood by a generation of listeners and musicians was also real and not recoverable. What is left is a specific image. A room in New York in the late 1960 seconds. A recording from 1928 playing in the corner. Miles Davis standing still, not moving, listening with everything he had to a man he had spent years dismissing. The trumpet playing in that recording was 50 years old by then. It was still doing what it had always done, making the room stop, making people listen the right way, making the distance between the music and the person hearing it disappear entirely. That was what Armstrong had known. That was what he had always known. The grin, the handkerchief, the warmth, the accessibility, none of it was surrender. It was the thing that got the music into the room where people were listening. And once the music was in the room, it did what it had always done. Miles Davis stood in that room and let it do it to him. Some lessons come late. The ones that come from a 1,928 trumpet recording in a New York room, while the man who played it is still alive, still playing, still doing the impossible thing he had been doing since he was 12 years old, those lessons land differently. Louis Armstrong never needed the apology. He had the music. He had always had the music. That was enough.